People on Reddit who got shot or stabbed, what's the sensation like? Story 1. I was almost brought to my knees when I felt a searing pain in my hip. It was like a burning sensation, and I could barely put any pressure on my leg. The pain was so intense, registering a solid 6 on a scale of 10. Fortunately, help arrived quickly in the form of an ambulance. In the ambulance, I was given a shot of morphine, which eased the pain to a 4. Soon after, I was wheeled into the operating room. Story 2. When I was a foolish and furious teenager, I once got stabbed in the gut. A fellow angry kid had pulled a knife and thrust it into my hip area. I hardly felt it. I instinctively punched him and ran off, but I only made it a few meters before collapsing. Fortunately, friends of mine were present and they surrounded me while one of them called an ambulance. The last thing I recall before losing consciousness was one of my buddies shouting something. I woke up a few days later in the hospital, unable to bend my abdomen at all. The pain around the area was a constant throbbing, but it was unbearable when I tried to bend over. Thankfully, the doctor said there was no major damage done. The blade had missed my intestines by a mere centimeter. Story 3. I was shot 6 times in a frightening robbery almost 10 years ago. One bullet hit me in the armpit or shoulder, 2 in the chest, 2 in the stomach, and 1 in the hip, which lodged in my hip bone and cracked it. Despite the shock, I was so full of adrenaline that I managed to walk a few blocks to the hospital, bleeding profusely and scaring the crowd in the lobby. The pain didn't really set in until I woke up post-surgery a few days later. Surprisingly, the broken ribs from the 2 bullets in the chest were more painful than any of the other wounds. Story 4. I was installing an air conditioner for a female resident at a group home when, suddenly, she lunged for me with a terrifyingly sharp pair of shears. She had been getting frustrated by my pace and took a swing at my groin. To my horror, the blade sunk deep into my lower abdomen near my bladder, causing immense pressure and burning that felt like a curling iron. In a panic, I managed to grab her wrist and smash it against the wall, sending the shears flying and revealing the bloodied wound. I was left with an open drain for weeks as it healed and had to use a bag to pee for a while. Story 5. I was in 7th grade at a high school track and field invitational when a fight suddenly broke out between a couple of schoolmates and a large group from another school. Despite being outnumbered, my friends and I were determined to protect the other guys. In the midst of the chaos, I felt someone grab my shoulder and pull me back, thinking they had punched me in the back. Fortunately, the police arrived in time to break up the fight and I went home. Little did I know, the next thing I'd wake up to was my mom's screams and me being rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. I'd been stabbed in the back with an ice pick, and while I was lucky enough to not bleed out, there was still blood in my back and filling the cavity near my kidneys and stomach. 8 months in the hospital and a stint at military school later, here I am, 41 years old, and grateful to the nurses and doctors who saved my life. Story 6. At 13, I was walking with a group of my friends down a busy street when a car filled with guys drove by and shots rang out. We quickly dove to the ground and waited for them to pass before getting back up. I continued walking, feeling like I'd been stung, but not thinking too much about it. When I told my friends to check my backside, they found a hole in my pants with a bit of blood. I'd been shot clean through the butt, but I didn't even realize it. We were headed to Starbucks, so we had the manager call an ambulance and my parents. I still can't believe I didn't even feel it. But that was nothing compared to the pain that I felt when I was shot in the side and the bullet cracked my rib. That was a billion times worse. I couldn't breathe and passed out from the intensity of the pain. Story 7. I was fighting bare-knuckled when I was stabbed in my lower back in the area around my kidney. I didn't even feel it. It was just a dull ache. When I touched my back, my hand was covered in blood. My pants were drenched and the blood ran all down my leg. I felt lightheaded but surprisingly calm. I passed out on the way to the hospital, but only briefly. The stitches hurt more than the stab itself. Story 8. I was a teenager and had this battle axe that could separate into a dagger. My friend and I practiced judo, learning to disarm knives and guns with a paintball, handgun, and sticks. One day, he decided to show his younger brothers how to attack someone with a knife using the axe dagger. I stepped in and instinctively put my hand up to stop him. Unfortunately, the blade went straight into my hand, but thankfully, it didn't come out the other side. Story 9. 3 years ago, my 13-year-old son stunned me when he calmly came into the living room and revealed he'd been stabbed and sliced his hand with a box cutter. Upon inspection, I was horrified to see that the blade had sliced through muscle and nerves and even exposed bone. Though he felt no pain when he inflicted the wound, I rushed him to the nearest medical center where he was given an anesthetic before the doctor stitched him up and administered a tetanus shot. It was only 10 to 15 minutes after the stitching that he began to feel any pain. Story 10. My heart was racing as I heard my ex-girlfriend's footsteps thundering through the house. I leapt to my feet and dashed to the bathroom, desperately grabbing at the door to pull it closed. In an instant, her carving knife plunged into my forearm, slicing open my skin as if I were a whale being cut up. Blood spurted everywhere as she continued stabbing at the door, leaving me cowering against it. I eventually mustered up the courage to pack a bag and make my way to the hospital, clutching a towel to my arm. At first, the pain was bearable, but after a few minutes, an intense throbbing and stinging from pins and needles set in. I realized that she had managed to cut a nerve in my forearm. I was lucky to have made it out alive. Story 11. I once impaled my forearm with a razor knife while constructing something. The blade went in about half an inch and fat oozed out of the wound, though there was barely any blood. It was a bizarre feeling, almost as if a small marble had been split in half and was now growing in my muscle. Whenever I flexed my fingers, I could sense the severed muscle fibers grinding together, which only added to the eerie marble-like sensation. Of all the injuries I've had, this was certainly one of the most gruesome, yet the pain was only about a 4 out of 10. I'd totally do it again. 8 out of 10. Story 12. At the age of 11, I made a stupid decision that I would regret thereafter. I had dropped a metal fence post with a spade end, and it fell against a fence, cutting a deep 2-inch gash into my leg below the knee. I was terrified that my parents would go ballistic, but oddly enough, I felt no pain, and it barely bled. When I pulled apart the wound, I noticed a white layer under the red dots, giving me some kind of clue as to what had happened. The worst part of the ordeal was the excruciating 3-hour wait to get it stitched up. Story 13. After getting out of the U.S. Army, I was enjoying a quiet evening by myself with a glass of brandy when I heard a noise coming from my backyard. Instinctively, I grabbed my M4-style weapon, loaded a round into the chamber, and, before I knew it, I had shot myself in the foot. It felt like a firecracker exploding in my hand, only 1,000 times worse. I let out a shrill scream, followed by manly curses from the intense pain. To make matters worse, the cops showed up, heard what happened, and rolled their eyes before leaving without even filling out a report. After all the years of service, I had managed to shoot myself in the foot only a month after being discharged. Story 14. When I was only 8 or 9, a pencil pierced through my arm in a most shocking manner. It stings a bit, but not really that much, just like when someone flicks you. However, I started to panic as soon as it came out of the other side of my arm, so it hurt more in my mind than in reality. Even worse, the doctor's prodding and poking during the examination of my injury caused more pain than the initial incident. Story 15. When I was about 9 or 10, my uncle shared a story with us about his high school days. He'd been hanging out with the wrong crowd, and they had taken him to a questionable place where they met their drug dealer. A brawl ensued, and my uncle was stabbed in the thigh. He said the initial shock made him numb, but then an agonizing wave of pain overcame him. What is the moral of the story? Don't be like me. I'm sure there are details of his story that I don't know, as I was just a child when all this happened. Story 16. I was lending a hand to Dad with fixing the wiring on one of his semi-trailers. We had to cut through some of the casing, and with me holding it steady, he attempted to start slicing. He struggled to get going before finally managing to break through. The blade ran effortlessly up the wire, but unfortunately also ran straight into my pinky. At first, I thought he had just knocked me down until I saw the blood. We soon got it bandaged up tight and secured a splint. Though it was sore for the entire 2 weeks, I was back to normal in no time.